Hello, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. This is our last exam review for Bio 141 AMP1 fall of 2020. Uh, Last and final lecture exam review. Today is Monday, December 7th. I'm recording this at 10:34 p.m. and should have it up on YouTube and post the link on Canvas in about an hour or so. Uh, the final exam, it's cumulative. In a sense, I would say it's cumulative because as I sent an email yesterday, and if you had looked at the email, I gave you a breakdown of how the exam is and what areas it covers. I have decided not to include any questions from cardiovascular system on the final exam since you're going to cover that in AMP2 further, and also we covered it during our last exam, so I would consider that it would still be very fresh in your mind. Instead, I tried to make this exam in a way so it would be more focused on the nervous system and, of course, the endocrine system, which we didn't get a chance to uh, have it on the exam, and that was the last lecture on week 15 that we had. So I never quizzed you on it. So about 20% is endocrine. I would say about 25% is endocrine and special senses, and about 40% is nervous. So add those up, that's about 65% is just those two topics. There are 60 questions, of which 59 are multiple choice and one is true or false. Questions that I have picked, since this is a final exam and I'm trying to basically examine you and test you on the basics and the objectives that you have learned from AMP1, the important concepts of AMP1. So I'm not going to be nitpicky and ask any detailed question. These are all very general based questions, which I'm sure you will be able to answer, and I'm sure you will be able to do great on with after you watch this exam review and do a little bit of reading. I wouldn't say it's going to take a long time for you to prepare for this exam, especially if you have been preparing throughout the course. You should be able to answer these questions easily. So 60 questions total. I'm going to give you 300 minutes, like always. Still, it is plenty of time, but I do not want any of you to feel rushed or run out of time. The exam due date is Sunday, December 13th. So this Sunday that's coming up at 11:59 p.m. I have to. This is very important, guys. I have to submit your final official grades to the registrar's office Monday, December 14 by 12 p.m. So whatever assignment that is missing from the grade book and you have not communicated with me about it uh, by Sunday night, December 13 at 12 o'clock midnight, right before we get to Monday, December 14th, if you have an assignment that hasn't been submitted and you have not emailed me about it, and you have not replied back to my emails that I have sent you asking you about the assignment that you have not turned in, and have tried to work out a plan for you and have not heard from you, you will receive a grade of 0 on those assignments, and that will affect your overall grade. Uh, Remember, a lecture exam is 140 points, a final lecture exam is 180 points. So uh, missing an assignment can affect your score greatly. As far as, so I want everyone to hear me again and to listen carefully, that I have to submit your grade to the registrar's office. The official grades will be submitted Monday, December 14, before 12 p.m. The deadline is 12 p.m. for me to submit it. So I want all of you to submit all the missing assignments by Sunday, December 13, 11:59 p.m. And if you have not communicated with me, and by Monday morning when I go to the grade book to put in the final grade and go to the registrar's office to send the official grade, if there is a missing assignment on there, I have no choice but to give you a 0 on that missing assignment, and that's going to affect your overall score. As soon as all your assignments have been turned in and you have submitted your final exam and you have finished and turned in all the assignments, I will email you immediately and give you your final class score or the final grade that you have in the class. So you don't be surprised. I mean, you will have access to it when you go on Canvas, but it can be confusing, and I'm going to go over this again. As you know by now, the course is divided into 2 sections. One is the lab section, one is the lecture section. The lecture section is overall 700 points. 180 points are from the final exam that is coming up. And I'm going to post the final exam as soon as I post the video, which would be probably in about an hour or by midnight. You will have both access to the final exam and the exam review video. And you will have until Sunday to submit the exam, or that's the deadline. So as soon as you finish the exam, this time with the exam, there are no bonus questions at the end, and there are no extra credit assignments for the final exam either. The only extra credit assignment is that 5 point that most of you will get because you submitted the course evaluation and you emailed me with a screenshot, or you emailed me that you have submitted it, and I have taken a note of it. I think the deadline for that was yesterday, so if the deadline has passed, that's out of my hand, because the evaluation is done by the college itself, and I don't have any access to it. I cannot change the date. I cannot see your reviews until the class is over and until your grades have been submitted, and then they would send the evaluations over to me, and then I would be able to see your comments and your evaluations. So and everything is anonymous. So that's the only extra credit points you will get added to your final exam grade, would be the 5 points if you submitted the extra credit, if you submitted the course evaluation. And by now, I have an understanding that about most of you, about 60 to 70% of you have submitted the course evaluation from my understanding that I know. So you will all, I have taken note of it, I will automatically add 5 points to your exam, to your final exam score. So that's the only extra credit assignment. Let's go over the grade breakdown for the class so it doesn't be confusing. Sorry, I have to keep hydrated. As I said, 700 points is from the lecture section. 180 points of that 700 point is your lecture final exam. So you know how important this exam is, guys. So don't take it for granted, even though there is this is the lecture exam review, and I think the exam is fairly easy and straightforward. There are no trick questions. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I'm basically asking very broad questions that about topics and objectives that you need to know before you go into AMP2. 420 points came from the 3 lecture exams that we had, each being worth 140 points. So that's 420 points right there. Discussion participation, we had 3 discussion board assignments, each worth 10 points, total 30 points. Homework assignments, we had 5 homework assignments. If you, by now, I think most of you have submitted all of them. If you have not, I mean, the deadline has passed already. Please email me, and we can work out a plan for the homework assignments that you have not submitted, because each homework assignment is worth 20 points, and that would be a total of 100 points. So all that would add up to 700 points. The next section is the lab section of the course, which is worth overall 300 points. There were 8 lab quizzes, each worth 20 points, and then 2 lab exams, each worth 70 points. So 140 points for the lab exams and 160 points for lab quizzes. So when you go to your grade book in the lab, whatever you see on the total, the numerical value, write that down. For example, let's say out of the 300, and you have taken all the quizzes, you have taken both lab exams, you have 280. Write down that 280. Go back to your lecture section of the course, go to the grade section, and look at your total in the lecture section. That total should be out of 700 points, basically. So whatever you have, this is assuming that you have already completed all the assignments and there are no missing assignments, and you have completed the final exam as well. You would take that total amount, let's say you got 600. Write that down, add the 600 to that 280 points, or to the total points from your lab section total, and whatever you get, 8 is in this case 880 points. Add them up, whatever points you get, divide that by 1000, because 700 plus 300 is 1000. So once you divide, it's easy. Right now, you know 880 divided by 1000, that's 88%. But to do it, if you want to know the calculation, that's your total points from lecture and lab divided by 1000, multiply that by 100. Or another way that you can do it is add up the total score from lab, total score from lecture, and multiply that by 0.1. So 80 times 0.1, I get 88%. That is a solid B. When would you get an A or the score would change? So we have A, B, C, D, and then I, and then F. Basically, I would be assigned to it. I have to fill out a form if you do not want to get an F, and if you have completed over 65% of the course material, and if you and I are both in agreement for you to get an I grade, grade the score of I instead of an F. I have to fill out a form, send it to the department, get it approved as well, saying that I am in agreement, the student is in agreement, and you will have until I think 6 months to complete the assignments and to complete the exams, and that grade would change. But that is very rare and is not usually. I mean, it depends. It's not an easy process, and that we have to have a legitimate reason of as to why you weren't able to complete over 45% of the assignments. Grade of an A is from 89.5 and above. So if your total average is 89.5, that's an A. If your average is 79.5, that's a B. If your average is 79.4, that's a C. If your average is 89.4, that's a B. And so 0.5. I know this is sometimes when I have to put in the grade, when I have to put in the final grade, I mean, it's really, really difficult for me to, based on 0.1, to assign a letter grade that, I mean, that's very much different. I mean, we're talking about A versus B. And I do understand how important the grade for this class is for a lot of you. I would say for all of you who, especially if you are going into a healthcare field and going into nursing school or a healthcare professional program, they will look at your A and P score, and they want to see A's and B's for you to get accepted to the program. That this is very important. This is not a humanitarian class or an art class where a C would be okay with them or a D would be fine, and they would just any healthcare program that you want to go into, nursing, they will look at your AMP 1 and 2 scores, and that's very important. So I want you all to do well on the class. Okay, let's talking and let's go over the exam review. First part that I'm going to start with is spatial senses. I want you to be able to know the distribution of rods and cones in the eye. Which area of the retina are they distributed? How are they distributed in different areas of the retina? So for that, I would refer you to a Spatial Senses lecture notes, page 7, section 12.13. And also, I would refer you to a Spatial Senses lecture notes, page 5, objective E, on the paragraph that starts with interna tunica. Read that paragraph. Next question that I have asked is, how is sound sensation conveyed through the cochlear nerve to the brain? I think there are two questions on this. How is sound sensation conveyed through the cochlear nerve to the brain? For that, I would refer you to page 12 of Special Senses Lecture Notes, section 12.18. Section 12.18. And sorry, I'm looking at the questions myself right now. Okay, section 12.18 of page 12 of Special Senses Lecture Notes. Also, I want you to know what are chemoreceptors, what are mechanoreceptors important for. Mechanoreceptors are important for hearing, balance, and touch and senses. For that, I would refer you to page 1 of Special Senses Lecture Notes, section 12.1. So if I give you an explanation of a special sense and ask you what is this special, if I give you the events in a special sense, and then I ask you which special sense is this based on the events that I have explained to you, you should be able to tell me if it's taste, smell, hearing, or vision. If you read through page 12 of a Special Senses Lecture Notes, section 12.18, and know what mechanoreceptors are important for that, page 1 of a Special Senses Lecture Notes, section 12.1. Next question is about optic nerve and optic tract. How do neurons within each one of these, how do neurons within optic nerve, how do neurons within optic tract carry information? For this, I would refer you to page 9 of a Special Senses Lecture Notes, section 12.16. Section 12.16. Next question that I have here is about auditory tube. I want you to be familiar with the auditory tube. For that, I would refer you to page 11 of a Special Senses, second paragraph, where it talks about the auditory tube. So page 11 of a Special Senses, second paragraph, where it talks about the auditory tube. Okay, that's all for the special senses. So the last question on the special senses was about the auditory tube. Page 11 of a special senses, second paragraph, where it talks about the auditory tube. Next section is the endocrine system. And it's a very important system. It's a very confusing system too, as well, if you don't have a good understanding of it. First question that I ask is, of course, about the structure of the pituitary gland. I want you to know the location of the pituitary gland, the attachment points of the pituitary gland, how it is attached to the brain, and how it is attached to the other structures as well. So for that, I would refer you to endocrine system lecture notes, page 4, objective E. Page 4, objective E. One thing about the pituitary gland is that I want to explain this to you instead of you having to read it. Maybe this can be easier to understand. So we have posterior and anterior. Remember, posterior pituitary gland does not make any hormones, does not synthesize any hormones. It's a storage point. So it's the storage vesicle. It's the storage area for all the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus, and then they are transported to the posterior pituitary gland and are stored there. This was a question on, and then they are released from the posterior pituitary. This was a question on the lab quiz, and nearly everyone got this question wrong, because I had asked how do the hormones in the posterior glands get released, and a lot of you had gotten it wrong. So the hormones that are in the posterior gland are synthesized and made in hypothalamus, transported to the posterior gland. They sit there. Posterior gland is acting as a storage area, and then based on a feedback mechanism, they are released from the posterior gland. How as far as the anterior pituitary, it is, the hormones there are produced by the anterior pituitary. There are very few, as you know, there are very few, and you need to be familiar with those hormones, and I will tell you the pages in a minute. So the anterior is basically synthesizes its own hormones. However, its release is controlled and influenced by the hypothalamic hormones, the releasing hormones, and the inhibiting hormones. So again, hypothalamus releases some hormones, whether we call these hormones hypothalamic hormones. They are either the hypothalamic hormones that are released from the hypothalamus, either releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones, and they go in and act on the posterior, act on the anterior pituitary gland, and they influence and control the anterior pituitary gland, whether to release those hormones that you have synthesized, or not to release those hormones that you have synthesized. As far as the pituitary gland itself, the shape, majority of the pituitary gland is made up of the anterior pituitary gland. It's much more, as far as the size, it's bigger than the posterior pituitary gland. So the explanations that I gave you should be enough for you to answer a lot of questions on this end if you understood what I was talking about. So anterior pituitary hormones, they are controlled and influenced by hypothalamic hormones. Hypothalamic hormones are either releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones that influence and control the anterior pituitary hormones. Anterior pituitary hormones are synthesized and made in anterior pituitary gland. Okay, for that I would refer you to, this is the best source, Endocrine Text Reading, page 337, the whole page, pituitary gland and hypothalamus. That's the topic, the section. It's under that section of page 337 of Endocrine Text Reading. Read the whole section, which talks about pituitary gland and hypothalamus, page 337. Next question is, of course, another essential question. I want you to be familiar with the effect of glucagon and insulin. Insulin, to put it in a very simple words, basically insulin decreases blood glucose, whereas glucagon increases blood glucose. For that, I would refer you to Endocrine Lecture Notes, page 13, section 13.26, and also Endocrine Supplemental Notes, page 8, under Description section. Next, I want you to be familiar with the adrenal gland. And basically how adrenal gland has two regions, the interior and the outer ear. The inner region, which is the adrenal cortex, has itself three different zones, and each zone secretes a different hormone. So specifically, I want you to be familiar with the glucocorticoids. And then glucocorticoids, which is a hormone that is released by adrenal cortex, one of the zones of adrenal cortex. It by itself, one of the examples of glucocorticoids is cortisol. And I want you to know about cortisol. I want you to know what glucocorticoids are and what they do, what are the side effects from them, and what are their effects on the body. For that, I would refer you to page 20 of Endocrine Supplemental Notes, the whole page. Page 20 of Endocrine Supplemental Notes, the whole page talks about glucocorticoids, starting with adrenal gland, the middle of adrenal gland, the middle section, which is adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex has three zones: the zone that secretes glucocorticoids, and an example of glucocorticoids being cortisol. So whole page 20 of Endocrine Supplemental Notes, definitely know that. Another question in that end that I have asked is on page 18 of Endocrine Supplemental Notes, the whole page. It's very similar to page 20, except this time it's talking about mineralocorticoids and the function and effects of the mineralocorticoids that are released by another zone of adrenal cortex. And that's on page 18 of Endocrine Supplemental Notes. Read the whole page. I want you to be familiar with adrenocorticotropin hormones. ACTH. It falls under that same page 20 of Endocrine Supplemental Notes. When you're reading about glucocorticoids, in the middle of the page, under the mechanism section, it talks about ACTH. Definitely know where ACTH works and what parts it affects. Uh, what ACTH stimulates release of what. So that's on page 20 of endocrine supplemental notes, middle of the page under mechanism section. That same page that you're studying about the glucocorticoids, to page 20 of endocrine supplemental notes. So read the whole page, as well as page 18 of the endocrine supplemental notes, whole page where it talks about mineralocorticoids. I want you to be familiar with anatomy and physiology of the parathyroid gland, PTH. For that, I would refer you to Objective H as Harry, page 9 of endocrine lecture notes. So know the especially physiology of PTH, parathyroid hormones. What are its function? What is its main function? It's very easy. It basically conserves calcium in any ways that it can, takes calcium outside the bone, inhibits the release of calcium, or reabsorbs calcium from the urinary system, and increases level of calcium in the blood. But do read about it. All the points that I mentioned are about parathyroid gland, especially the physiology of it and how it works, what it does, on page 9 of endocrine lecture notes, Objective H as Harry. Next question is about melatonin. Melatonin is a very important hormone. I would refer you to endocrine text reading, page 350 under section. It's on the bottom of the page that talks about melatonin. Bottom of the page of 350 of endocrine text reading. A lot of you should be able to answer the question without even needing to go to that page. I mean, you all know what melatonin is, what hormone it is, and what it triggers. As you know, melatonin triggers sleep. And is its level the same during all the time throughout the body? No. During morning time, there is lower level of melatonin in the body. Compared to evening and night, you have higher level of melatonin in the body. And definitely know where it's synthesized from, and so that should do it for melatonin. The reason I ask about melatonin is you will probably run into it again, since it's a supplement that is sold over the counter for people who have sleeping issues and sleeping problems. It's very helpful to some people. To some people, it's not helpful at all. Some people take 3 milligram of it and they fall asleep. Some people take 9 milligram and it doesn't do anything for them. So it's different. It's case-to-case basis, and those people who that doesn't work for usually try Unisum or some sort of antihistamine, first-generation antihistamine, which is like chlorpheniramine or even Benadryl, which is diphenhydramine. They tried that, but the side effect with that is it does make you sleepy and drowsy, but the next morning when you wake up, you're still groggy and you're still very tired because of the side effect of antihistamine. And then if that doesn't work, then there is the prescription drugs that are out there. However, usually a lot of them, like Ambien and Lunesta are controlled substances, and doctors hesitate to prescribe them because of abuse potential. Okay, next one is about going back. I want you to know how and where thyroid hormones are synthesized. For that, I would refer you to page 8 of Endocrine Lecture Notes, section 13.6. Section 13.6. It talks about how and where thyroid hormones are synthesized. Page 8 of Endocrine Lecture Notes, section 13.16. Next question is going back to the pituitary. I want you to know all the organs and the glands that are regulated by the pituitary. There is a very beautiful figure on page 338 of Endocrine Text Reading, which basically connects the areas of the pituitary and the hormones that they release to each organ of the body, or to basically the glands that are regulated by the pituitary, regardless, anterior or posterior, all of them. Which glands do they work on, and which glands or organs do they influence? Negative and positive feedback mechanism. We have already talked about this. However, in this chapter, that's where negative and positive feedback come into play. I want you to refer to Objective C, page 2 of Endocrine Lecture Notes, and be familiar and know negative and positive feedback. I will ask an example question of which of the following is an example of negative feedback, which of the following hormones. And there are not that many hormones that follow positive feedback except one, and that's oxytocin. And the way that it follows for positive feedback is during childbirth. Everything else is usually negative feedback. Okay, now we are going to the nervous system. I'm going to go through this very quickly because these you have already covered and you should know a lot of them. So again, important concept. I have to ask a couple of questions on you knowing the steps of the nervous impulse conduction, the resting potential, depolarization, repolarization. Remember, resting, the inside is negative, the outside of the cell is positive. The inside is usually negative 70, and that is maintained, that negative 70 and the positive on the outside is maintained by the sodium potassium pump. So it's an ongoing process because potassium and sodium are leaking in and out. So in order to keep that potential at resting, that is maintained, the resting potential, remember, the resting potential is maintained by sodium potassium pump. Next is the depolarization, where voltage gated sodium channels open. And what does sodium do? Does it go inside the cell or does it go outside of the cell? Sodium is positive. You would imagine sodium is always abundant and more of sodium outside of the cell than inside. So sodium, when that voltage gated sodium channel opens, sodium goes inside the cell and causes depolarization. Next is repolarization, where voltage gated potassium channels open, and in this case potassium potassium is positive, goes outside of the cell. Potassium that's inside the cell goes outside to re-establish that negative voltage, basically. Now, sometimes during that repolarization period, you have too much potassium leaking out and leaving the cell. So the cell becomes even more negative than -70. That we call hyperpolarization. So I want you to be familiar with hyperpolarization and how it happens. Hyperpolarization happens where potassium is leaving the cell, and through the potassium voltage gated potassium pump, enough has already left to bring that potential to -70, but somehow there is even more potassium that leaks out and the voltage goes to -80, -90, and we call that hyperpolarization. So know that. For all that, I would refer you to page 10 of Nervous System Supplemental Notes, Part 1, and page 246 of Nervous System Text Reading, Part 1, under generation of action potential. So on page 10 of Nervous System Supplemental Notes, Part 1, read the whole page. On page 246 of Nervous System Text Reading 1, read the section under generation of action potential. Read the whole section. I want you to know what types of neurons there are. 3 types of neurons: unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. Specifically, be familiar with the multipolar neurons and know what neurons can connect to, what these neurons can connect to. For that, I would refer you to page 8 of Nervous System Supplemental Notes, Part 1, under description section, and also under neurons connect to section. So page 8 of Nervous System Supplemental Notes, there are 2 sections. I want you to read the description section on page 8, and then I want you to read the neurons connect to section. Next thing, I want you to know basically the parasympathetic outflow and which nerves carry it. For that, I would refer you to page 290 of Nervous System Text Reading, Part 3. Parasympathetic outflow and basically what carries it. And you should know with parasympathetic, when I say what carries it, I mean what nerve. About 70% of the parasympathetic outflow is carried by vagus nerve. So definitely know that. That's a question. Next, easy. I want you to be able to describe cerebrum. For that, I would also refer you to Objective C, page 2 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2. When you are on that section, when you're reading Objective C on page 2 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2, you're reading about cerebrum. Also know, also talks about corpus callosum and how it connects the 2 cerebral hemispheres. You should already know that from lab. Next, I want you to be familiar with the location of pre-central gyrus and also post-central gyrus. I want you to know what is pre-central gyrus and where it's located. Pre-central gyrus is located in the frontal lobe, whereas post-central gyrus is located in the posterior lobe, posterior to the central sulcus. And as far as what precentral gyrus is, it contains the primary motor area of cerebral cortex. So precentral gyrus, frontal lobe, and it contains the primary motor area of cerebral cortex. Post-central gyrus, it's in the back, posterior to central sulcus, and it contains the primary somatosensory area of cerebral cortex. For that, I would refer you to page 268 of Nervous System Text Reading, Part 2, under Cerebrum section, last paragraph. Next, I want you to be familiar with the projection fiber, specifically the ascending tracts of projecting fiber and what they do. For that, I would refer you to page 4 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2, Section 10.8. Next, I want you to know the function of cerebellum. The function of cerebellum, you should already know it. I don't need to refer you to anything. It's balance and motor coordination. I want you to be familiar with gray and white matter. For that, I would refer you to page 243 of Nervous System Text Reading, Part 1, under the section Gray and White Matter. And also page 1 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2, Section 10.1. I want you to be familiar with the 3 general groups of cerebral cortex, specifically the association area of cerebral cortex and association area of cerebral cortex again divides up to other areas. From there, I want you to be familiar with the prefrontal area of association area of cerebral cortex. For that, I would refer you to page 12 of Nervous System Supplemental Notes, Part 2. Read the association area section, is towards the bottom of the page. I want you to know the function of thalamus. You should already know this. It's on page 2 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2. It's in table 10.1. That's where you can also see the function of cerebellum as well. Page 2 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2, table 10.9. I want you to be familiar with left and right cerebrum hemisphere. A lot of us already know that. And the functional differences of each. Call it the left brain versus the right brain. Usually the left brain is associated with language and logistics. We call it the analytical brain. The right brain is music and artistic. We call it the creative brain. If you're left-handed, that means there is more activity on your right brain. Usually left-handed people have a great sense of imagination. They are more artistic and emotional, whereas right-handed individuals are more linguistics. They are better public speakers, and they can write very well, and they have a better sense of logic, and they have great analytical skills. I mean, that's not necessarily true, but that's the basic. For that, I would refer you to page 20 through 21 of Nervous System Supplemental Notes, Part 2. I want you to be familiar with the limbic system. Limbic system, page 7 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2, Section 10.15. Section 10.15 of page 7 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 2. Of course, there is going to be a question on sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation. No, sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. Sympathetic is adrenergic and cholinergic. Parasympathetic is all cholinergic. When we say adrenergic, we are talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if I say associate norepinephrine with either parasympathetic or sympathetic, you would associate norepinephrine with sympathetic nervous system and not parasympathetic nervous system, because that's an adrenergic, versus cholinergic can be either. Cholinergic can be parasympathetic and also sympathetic. For that, I would refer you to page 3 of Nervous System Lecture Notes. Page 3 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 3. Part 3 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, page 12. And also on that same page, section 11.23. And then go on to the next page. Look at table 11.5, which is on page 13 of Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 3. So again, Nervous System Lecture Notes, Part 3, page 12 and page 13. Objective G, section 11, Objective G, read Objective G. Also read section 11.23, and on the next page, look through table 11.5. Next one is very important and very essential to know the divisions of the nervous system, how it all starts. We have the central nervous system, and then we have peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system breaks down in two. We have the autonomic and then somatic. Somatic section of the peripheral nervous system divides into two. We have the sensory neurons in somatic, and then we have motor neurons in somatic. Be able to know the difference between autonomic and somatic, and then be familiar with the sensory neurons of the somatic. The sensory neurons of the somatic basically are from somatic receptors to the CNS. So would we call that afferent or efferent? So we call that afferent. So sensory neurons are also afferent. Sensory somatic neurons are afferent. And then sensory motor and then somatic motor neurons, they carry from CNS to specifically a skeletal muscle. And when you carry from CNS to the body or the skeletal muscle, it's efferent. So that's motor neuron, part of the somatic, and it's under voluntary control. I want you to know the parts of reflex arc. For the other one, I forgot to give you a page number for the somatic section of the peripheral nervous system and the sensory neurons of it and the motor neurons. I would refer you to page 244 of nervous system text reading part 1 under the section peripheral nervous system. Read the whole section on page 244 of nervous system text reading part 1. I want you to know the parts of reflex arc. That's on page 4 of nervous system supplemental notes, part 2, somatic reflex arc. Not specifically this time, I'm not asking you to put the steps in order, but know what neurons are involved. Know what neurons are involved in the whole process of reflex arc. We have the sensory neurons, the motor neurons. Between sensory and motor neurons, the interneurons are also involved. Almost done. Now we are going to the muscular and skeletal. Very few questions. I want you to know differences between actin and myosin. Myosin is also called the thick filament. Actin is the thin filament. For that, I would refer you to page 2 of muscular system supplemental notes. Know which ones include actin, troponin, and tropomyosin. That would be the thin filament or the thin filament. Which one has the myosin head? That would be the thick filament. And which one has the binding site for calcium? That would be the thin filament. So page 2 of muscular system supplemental notes. I want you to know the muscle attachment sites. That's very basic, very general, that you should have a good understanding of. The muscle attachment sites. The origin, which is the stationary part, and then the insertion, which is the movable part. For that, I would refer you to page 216 of muscular system text reading section under the section origin, insertion, and action. Read the whole section. Page 216 of muscular system text reading. I want you to be familiar and know about fibula. Page 23, skeletal system lecture notes, section 6.41. I want you to be familiar with pelvis or pelvic girdle. Page 20, skeletal system lecture notes, objective L. I want you to know the cranial bones and what bones make up the cranial bones. Page 3, skeletal system lecture notes, table 6.1. I want you to know the structure of the sternum. Page 16, skeletal system lecture notes, section 6.28. I want you to be familiar with the structure of a typical long bone, specifically epiphyseal line, epiphyseal plate. I would refer you to page 6 of a skeletal system lecture notes, objective F. Let's go to the skin. I want you to be familiar with the sweat glands, specifically eccrine and apocrine glands. Page 9 of integumentary or skin, page 9 of integumentary system lecture notes, section 5.27. Read about eccrine and apocrine glands. Skin color. That's very important to understand skin color. The structural basis of a skin color. Go to page 160, page 160 of integumentary system text reading under the section the structural basis of a skin color. Read the whole section. basically what causes the change in skin color, and that's the amount of melanin. Melanocytes are the cells that produce melanin. What's very important, what students always confuse and get wrong on the question, is that you have to remember, everyone, all people, regardless of race, skin color, age, we all have the same number of melanocytes. It's just a person who is darker, they probably have more melanin. And so the difference in the skin color is due to the amount of melanin. I want you to be familiar with the composition of epidermis. Composition of epidermis, page 3 of Integumentary System Lecture Notes, section 5.6. I want you to know, be familiar with the transport systems, very important, active and passive transport systems. Page 14 of Cell Supplemental Notes, read the whole page. Specifically, my question is about which one of the transport system requires energy, and you should know that off top of your head right now. Is it facilitated? Is it osmosis? Is it passive? Which one is it that requires energy? And that's the sodium potassium pump that requires energy. I want you to be familiar with the phospholipid description, page 4 of Cell Supplemental Notes, under the description section. Let's go to the tissue. I want you to be able to compare the 3 types of muscle tissues: a smooth, cardiac, and a skeletal. For that, I will refer you to page 8 of Tissue Lecture Notes, table 4.7. And last but not least, know what organic compounds are and know the examples of the major families of organic compounds. Go to page 7 of Chemistry Lecture Notes, section 2.16. Wow, that was long. 1 hour and 7 minutes. Guys, I have to make 2 more videos for my other classes. So good luck everyone on the exam. I'm sure you will do good. I know I went through this very fast. Sometimes you might have to pause and go back and listen to it again and jot down the notes. But if you go based on what I just said and the pages and the sections and the tables that I referred you to and read those, you should do fine on the final exam. If you have any questions, please email me. And best of luck to everyone. Thank you.